the go now.
That's fine. That is fine. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Dina, thank you for your sponsorship and much appreciated. Nice to see everybody here. Can see Danny as well. I assume you're in London, Danny. It's slightly warmer here. It's always a pleasure to get together on a Tuesday morning and learn a little bit of Torah together. We're looking at some of the very profound themes that come up in Sefer Bereshis. And as I mentioned to you a few times before, Sefer Bereshis is really a template for the whole of the Tanakh. Everything that happens in the Tanakh has its sheirish, has its roots in Sefer Bereshis. It's a bit like the DNA of Jewish history and of the whole Torah is in the book of Bereshis. And all the themes which really unfold later on in the Chumash and in the Tanakh are already grounded in Sefer Bereshis. So we're going to be looking at it from that point of view. We spent the last few weeks looking at chapter 3 of Bereshis, which develops the whole events of Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve in Gan Eden. And as I mentioned, the English word paradise for Gan Eden comes from the Hebrew word pardes, because the Torah describes Gan Eden as an orchard of fruit trees. And of course, Dina is giving a correction, and there is it's Tivona is the dedication. Dina, is that right? Is it Tivona? Yes, you are muted, as a matter of fact, Dina, so I can't actually hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's my father's wife. It's her kavura today. Tivona Batsara.
Father's wife has passed away. So we are dedicating the share to her memory. Tivona Bas, what is it?
Abraham.
Tivona Bas Avram. Should be an Ilu Neshama for her.
Amen.
Thank you for your sponsorship, Dina. You may now unmute yourself once again. So we've looked, just to remind you, last week we looked at a very fascinating theme in the Medrash about how Chazal drew for us a whole, if you like, Midrashic saga of what happened to the clothes that God makes for Adam and Chava. Just as they're about to leave Gan Eden, he makes for them kosnos or vayal bishem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as the Gemara says, is malbish arumim. He gives them clothes, and of course these clothes made by HaKadosh Baruch Hu have an eternal power to them. They're not just simple clothes. They're not going to wear out. They're not going to go out of fashion, and they have extremely interesting spiritual powers. Chazal had a Maseira that these powers enabled anybody who was wearing these clothes to have a supernatural effect on the animal kingdom around them, to subdue the animals and to hunt the animals, and that this was and therefore it was a tremendous gift. It wasn't just in order to cover their nakedness, but it gave them a gift to survive as delicate human beings in a world of predatory animals. In the absence of having weapons and houses and things yet to protect themselves, they needed a protection. What Chazal tell us, though, is that these garments were then taken by Nimrod, who used them for his own power to build up his own power base. And from Nimrod, they were taken. There was a battle, Midrashic battle, which we don't find in the Chumash at all, between Nimrod later on and Esav. And then Esav takes these clothes, and then when Yaakov goes in to get the brachas from his father and pretends to be Esav, those are the clothes that he wears. Those are the clothes that he wears, and therefore the Pasuk says that Yitzchak is only convinced that he should now give the brachas by Yorach as Reach Begodov, when he smelled the fragrance of the clothes that Yaakov was wearing, on which Rashi says, Nichnas imo reach Gan Eden, that the fragrance of Gan Eden was still in these clothes. And when Yitzchak sensed that the person in front of him, who he thought was Esav, was wearing the clothes of Gan Eden, that triggered off in him the ability to give the brachos of Yitzchak Elokim. And that's the whole theme is a very interesting one. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch makes an interesting point, which is actually developed by the Maharal Prague several centuries earlier, that actually the clothing, the idea of clothing is of course for us an important concept of tznius, of physical modesty. But the Maharal makes an interesting point once or twice in his writings, that tznius is not actually emes, which is very interesting. In other words, it says that the emes of life, the truth of life, is actually nakedness. And we actually use the phrase in English, don't we? The idea of the naked truth. We speak about the naked truth. What do we mean when we say the naked truth? We mean the absolute truth, which may be uncomfortable or painful or difficult to hear, but it is nevertheless the truth. So the idea is that actually tznius means covering ourselves up, but to a certain extent, clothing by definition is an attempt to appear to be different than we really are, because we really are naked, and the clothing makes us appear differently. So in a sense, the whole idea of wearing clothing as the most important preparation for leaving Gan Eden and going out into this worldly existence as we know it today was the ability to really conceal oneself and not to live completely a life of total emes. Gan Eden was a world of total emes. Outside of Gan Eden, we need to have an ability to protect ourselves and conceal ourselves to a certain extent, in order to survive, in order to interact with other people. And Rav Hirsch makes an interesting connection between the word beged, which means a clothing, Beis Gimel Daled, and boged. A boged is somebody who is a what's a good word for boged? Somebody who is treasonable,
a rebel.
A rebel, but he's also more than that. He's boged is often somebody who's a spy, who pretends to belong to one side, but actually is spying for a different side. He's committing treason. Committing treason is a boged. So in a sense, a beged and boged have a conceptual link to them, that everybody, all the time, is really wearing clothing. And the clothing is a hallmark, really, of the world in which we live. We don't live in the world of naked truth, of absolute truth. Of course, we live in a world where we are committed to emes in so many different ways, both bein odom lachaveira, bein odom lamokim. But nevertheless, the world itself is a world in which, in order to survive and not to hurt ourselves, not to hurt other people, we need to cover ourselves up. And that is the whole theme of the beged. And in a sense, it's interesting, because I want to tell us that when Yaakov pretends to be Esav and goes in to get the brachas from Yitzchak, he is doing that. He is concealing his identity, but really what he's doing is the emes. In other words, he's in the pursuit of a higher truth, a truth which Rivka understands, that he needs to protect himself from Esav. But what's interesting is that the clothing represents this whole thing. Okay, that's something we looked at the end of last week's shir, which is a much bigger topic worthy of our attention. What I'd like to do today is have a look at the closing pasuk, the closing verse of chapter 3. How does this whole saga end? And I'd also like to start chapter 4, which is the chapter of Cain and Hevel, which is the next drama in Sefer Bereshis. Also an extremely fascinating episode, which we're going to have a look at. But let's first have a look at the closing pasuk of chapter 3. Hopefully I can get hold of this. Okay, I can see I've got here Cain and Hevel, which I don't want to get at just yet. Ladies and gentlemen, bear with me for 1 second. bear with me for 1 second. Right. That's better. Okay. Can you see a text? Yes? Yes? Good, thank you. This is the last pasuk of chapter 3. Vayigoresh es ha'adam. Right? Goresh means to drive him out, from the word gerushin, actually. Gerushin is divorce, right? To separate from someone. So there was a close, in Gan Eden, there was a closeness between Adam and Chava and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Vayigoresh es ha'adam, comma. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu drove Adam and Chava away. Okay, we know that already from the previous pasuk, but now it says something very interesting. Vayashkein mikedem legan Eden es hakruvim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu positioned the kruvim. He positioned the kruvim. So the kruvim, we know about kruvim. Kruvim is one of the words used in the Tanakh for malachim, right? There are seraphim and ophanim and the kruvim, the malachei hashares of various sorts are called malachim. I'm not going to go into the topic of malachim at the moment. Maybe another time we'll look at it more closely. But we know particularly the kruvim were present on the Oron HaKodesh, on the kapores, the lid of the Oron HaKodesh in the Holy of Holies, in the Kodesh Kadoshim. There were the two kruvim facing each other. There were sort of statues of two malachim type figures, Posek and Ophayim, with wings spread over the Oron HaKodesh. It's probably of the whole Beis HaMikdash details, it's probably the strangest detail in the whole of the Beis HaMikdash, which we'll look at some later date. But the kruvim, in some way, represent the kedusha, the sanctity of the Holy of Holies, of the Kodesh Kadoshim, and of the Oron HaKodesh, and of the Torah. But here they're playing a very interesting role. Here it's a first mention we find in the Torah of the kruvim, and they are placed at the exit, so to speak, the exit of Gan Eden. Adam and Chava are expelled from Gan Eden, and at the exit, HaKadosh Baruch Hu places these malachim, the kruvim. And what are they holding, these kruvim? They're holding Ve'eslahat hacherev hamit hapechet. Right? So lahat means fire, and cherev means a sword, and mitapechet means, he translated here as an ever turning. Lahafoch, right? Lehitapech means to roll over. The constantly turning over sword of fire. So this is all very mysterious. Both the presence of the kruvim and a fiery sword, and why is it turning over and over? And what is it actually? What are they doing there? What's their role? Why aren't they just expelled from Gan Eden? Full stop, right? So the pasuk here says something very interesting. Lishmar es derech eitz hachayim. So the simple meaning here is to protect the Gan Eden, because as the previous pasuk said, Gan Eden contained the eitz hachayim. The eitz hachayim, in some sense, was a source of eternal life, a source of eternity, and they didn't deserve anymore to be in the presence of the eitz hachayim. I mentioned to you in an earlier share that Chazal see the word eitz hachayim as a reference to the early Torah, the primordial Torah that was given to Adam and Chava. Right from the very beginning, they were given a basic Torah, which later on came to be known as the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, the 7 Noachide laws. But the Eitz HaChaim was much more than that. It was a spiritual doctrine of how to live the ultimate spiritual life. And indeed, 500 years ago, when the Arizal in Tzfat is writing, or his Talmidim are writing down his thoughts, the Sefer is called the Sefer Eitz HaChaim. Eitz HaChaim came to be known as one of the textbooks in Kabbalah, in Kabbalistic literature. And we refer to the Eitz HaChaim, right? Eitz Chaim hila machazikim bo v'temchei ma'usha. The Eitz Chaim, the pasuk in Mishlei. The Eitz Chaim is a code word for the Torah itself, the tree of life. There have been books written called the Tree of Life. The Tree of Life refers to the Torah itself. Not all of these books, incidentally, are kosher books. Some of you might know the famous book, The Tree of Life, which is not such a kosher book. That's by Louis Jacobs. That's maybe a topic for another time. Al kol panim, these keruvim were there to guard the way to the Tree of Life. Now, the interesting feature here is I want to learn with you a little bit, some of the Mefarshim who go a little bit deeper into this subject. So as I said, Rashi says, and the simple meaning is, the Malachim were there to protect, to prevent Adam and Chava going back into Gan Eden. But you see here, for example, the Malbim writes, have a look at this, Vayashke Mikedim LeGan Eden, right? So it says the Malbim, Reish Lamed, can you see here? The Reish Lamed means Rotz, the Reish Lamed here is as abbreviation for Rotzaloima. Rotzaloima. So Rotzaloima is always a little bit of a code word in the Mefarshim. Rotzaloima means these words mean something other than what they appear to mean. In other words, it's warning you that there's a meaning here beyond the simple translation of the words. Rotzaloime, what he wants to tell you is, Uvecholze logorshu migan Eden lonetzach. That nevertheless, even though they were expelled from Gan Eden, they were not expelled from Gan Eden lonetzach. They weren't meant to be expelled permanently from Gan Eden. Gan Eden remains a possible destination for human beings. He says, and how does that work? Says the Malbim, Ki heichin lefonov haderech. What this pasuk is referring to is the way sheyoshuv el Gan Eden, that it's possible to return to Gan Eden acha hamaves, after a person dies. The idea that the neshama of a human being is drawn back to Gan Eden after death, right? That idea has its roots in this story of Bereshit chapter 3. That mankind originally existed in Gan Eden, and that Gan Eden is the real destination for mankind, but they can't, the neshama can't return to Gan Eden so long as it's still connected to the body. After they ate from the forbidden fruit, after the Chet Eitz Hadas, the consequence was that in order to return to Gan Eden, we need to separate from the body, and the neshama goes back. So he says, "Im yomus mos yesharim." If he dies a death of a mos yesharim, because this is he borrows the word mos yesharim is a borrowed phrase from Bilam, right? Tomus nafshi mos yesharim. Now Bilam doesn't want to live an ethical and moral and spiritual life. He wants to live a life of curses and destruction, but he wants to die the death of an honest man, right? There are people like that who appreciate how important it is to die the death of an honest man, but don't actually want to live the life of an honest man. That's what Bilam is saying. But here he's just borrowing the phrase and saying that what's happening here is, so have a look, now let's have another look at this pasuk. That he says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts the keruvim there with this sword, and what are they doing there? So the Malbim gives us a translation which is the diametric opposite of Rashi, which is very interesting. Rashi says the keruvim were there with the sword to make sure that they won't get back into Gan Eden. The Malbim says the Malach is there with the sword to make sure they do get back into Gan Eden, to make sure that the neshama will find its way back to Gan Eden. That's what's important. In other words, they're only so long as they are in this world are they banished from Gan Eden. So he says, B'ma shehishkiach al ha'adam, lo seislo Torah mitzvos. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was concerned about the human being to give them Torah mitzvos, sheyeda haderech, that a person should know the way of life, how to abandon the sin of Hadas Tovara, the Hevle Ha'olam, and not to be immersed in the Hevel of this world. We're going to come back to the word Hevel shortly. Hevel means things which are intrinsically worthless, things which are only valuable temporarily, and it refers to the transitory nature of the physical world, that a person is able to commit himself to spiritual and eternal values, and then the Yoshuv Lechol Me'etz HaChaim, that the human being should be able to return to the Eitz HaChaim. In other words, the Eitz HaChaim is a represent for the Malbim and for many of the Mefarshim. The Eitz HaChaim represents what we refer to as Olam Haba, right? And we often speak to Began Eden, right, in our tefillas of Kel Molei Rachamim, right? We speak about Began Eden Tahei Menuchosam, that the neshama resides in Gan Eden, right? And in fact, the Malbim here just let's reflect on this just for a minute. Well, the Malbim here really is telling us, why do we need to know this whole story of Bereshis chapter 3? So they did an Aveira, they're thrown out of Gan Eden. Gan Eden is ancient history. It belongs with the dinosaurs and in a world which is no longer here. Why is that so important? It takes a whole chapter of the Torah. So the Malbim is saying, no, the Torah is telling us something of vital importance for the human being, that there was once a Gan Eden, right? And the objective of the human being is to in some way reconnect with that source. And ultimately, after leaving this world, the neshama is drawn back to Gan Eden only because it was once there in the beginning. In other words, it returns. It doesn't go to somewhere new. The neshama, after leaving this world, doesn't go to a place it's never been to before. The neshama goes back to the Gan Eden from which it originated, right? And the idea of the, so just to give you a little bit of a brief synopsis of what the Malbim is about to tell us, so the idea of the Keruvim represent the Torah. The Keruvim are the Malachim who are on guard on the Oren HaKodesh, in the Kodesh Kodashim, and they're on guard in order to make sure that human beings do find their way back to the Torah, find their way back to living a life of Avodas Hashem, of spiritual values. And the Cherev and the sword that they're holding is in fact the sword of death. In other words, it's only after death, if a person combines the message of the Keruvim with the sword, then this is the way in which they can get back to the Derech Eitz HaChaim. I think it's a very fascinating perush of the pasuk, that Lishma Derech Eitz HaChaim means the neshama can find its way back to Gan Eden, but not so long as it's connected to the body. Only after it's disconnected from the body, the neshama does find its back, provided it has lived a life according to the message of the Keruvim. The Keruvim represent this spiritual message. And I find this particular perush to be very, very very, very inspirational and very beautiful. I don't know if I want to go through the whole thing. Just very briefly, right? The Keruvim represent the nevuah of the Torah, to teach a person how to live with mitzvahs. Right, so it brings a pasuk in Yechezkel that the Keruvim are, if you like, the messengers from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to bring us spiritual messages. V'chein HaTorah shesama Hashem al Moshe nitna ba'alef mem. Alef mem is the Ohel Moed. Mibein kanfei HaKeruvim. The Torah emphasized a couple of places that the Koil Hashem that came to Moshe Rabbeinu in the Ohel Moed, in other words, in the Midbar, all the Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe Leimor in the Torah, all those messages came from a voice which came to Moshe Rabbeinu, and the pasuk says, "Mibein shnei hakruvim." The voice came from between the Keruvim. In other words, the Keruvim here, on the one hand, Keruvim represents something which we don't quite understand what it means, Malachim, but we do understand, says the Malbim, that the Keruvim were objects which were positioned crucially at the epicenter of the spiritual world of Klal Yisrael in the Kodesh Kodashim on the Aron HaKodesh, and they represent the Dvar Hashem. That this is the Derech Eitz HaChaim, the way back, and the wings of the Keruvim have got lots of interesting, very fascinating aspects to them. For those people who are currently learning Daf Yomi, and even for the rest of us who are going to celebrate Sukkot in the not too distant future, it's interesting that Chazal, when they wanted to describe to us the crucial part of the Sukkah, is the schach, right? The covering of the schach, and they use this word schach because it connects to the Keruvim. The Keruvim, the Pasuk describes these Keruvim in Sefer Shemos, when it's Truma Tetzaveh, when it's describing the way in which they're built, so it uses the word sochachin bekanfeim, that the malachims, the wings of the malachim were covering over from above, and that's the word schach, samach kaf sofit. That word schach is used for our sukkah, and it's an allusion to the kanfei hakruvim, that when we're sitting in the sukkah, we are sitting underneath the wings of the kruvim. Maybe more about that when we get closer to Sukkot. I'll call upon him. So he says here, I'm still with the Malbim. Bezos Shenis, Yoshev Gan Eden. Right? And the second condition that tragically they will only get back to Gan Eden is the Cherev HaMisapeches, the sword of Cherev Malach HaMoves, Shal Yodo Mafrid Ben HaNefesh VaGeviyah, VaNefesh Teitzei Mi Ma'asora. The neshama then is able to leave its interesting language of the Malbim. Ma'asara, ma'asar means a prison. In a sense, the body, on the one hand, is the home of the neshama during the life in this world, but from an ultimate spiritual sense of word, the body is a ma'asar, is a prison for the neshama. But tispashet bin hagviyah el gan eidna, then the neshama is able to detach itself from the body after death and return to Gan Eden. Okay, so this is, I think, a very interesting interpretation of this final pasuk, which gives us a key to the whole chapter. Why did we need to know this whole chapter? Why is it important? What is the impact of this whole chapter on the future of mankind? Okay, they did an Aveira, they're thrown in Gan Eden. We all know we're not living in Gan Eden, right? We all know that Gan Eden is an idyllic world of pure harmony, harmony between man and God, harmony between man and nature, harmony between the body and the soul. All the different harmonies were in perfect synchronization in Gan Eden. And we all know we're not living in that world. Why do we need to hear this story? Says the Malbim, it's very important, this story, because that's where the neshama is going to go back to after it leaves the body, and those are the kruvim and the cherev, and that is a beautiful pasuk, a beautiful interpretation. I also want to show you a Medrash Rabbah, which was extremely important for Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch. So those of you who are enthusiasts of Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, and you all should be, and if you're not, something to work on to be more of an enthusiast. So have a look at this pasuk. It says, "Vaygaresh es ha'adam," our original pasuk, and it says later on, the way back is lishmar et derech eitz hachayim. So this word, derech eitz hachayim, this word, derech eitz hachayim, is a word that Chazal are interested in. What is the word derech? Why derech and why eitz hachayim? What does it mean? It could just say lishmar ala petach, to guard the entrance or the exit. So look at this medrash that Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch is very interested in, and this medrash became the origin of his whole slogan for the Jewish life that Shimshon Raphael Hirsch was advocating, which was Torah in derech eretz. And the origin of the concept of Torah in derech eretz comes from this Medrash Rabbah on this pasuk. Let's have a quick look at it. The Amar Rabbi Yishmael bar Rav Nachman says as follows: Esrim v'shisha doros. There were 26 generations. Let me just stop here for 1 second. The 26 generations, you find occasionally in Chazal a reference to 26 generations. What are these 20? Anybody know what these 26 generations are? Any offers? Why are there? What is significant in the Torah about 26 generations? The answer is, if you look in the psukim of Sefer Bereshis and Shemais, you find the chronology of the Chumash gives us 10 generations from Adam till Noach. Are you with me? And then another 10 generations from Noach to Avraham. Okay? And then from Avraham Avinu, you get Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Levi, Kahos, Moshe. Are you with me? So Moshe Rabbeinu is the 26th generation from Adam Harishon, right? 10 from Adam to Noach, 10 from Noach to Avram, and then Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Levi, Kahos, Kahos, Amram, Moshe. Okay, so it's Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Levi, Kahos, Amram. So that's 26 generations. And then Moshe Rabbeinu is already the generation which receives the Torah. I think that's how it works. Akol Ponim, it's 26 generations of mankind, right, prior to Matan Torah. In fact, next time on Shabbos morning, you say the special Pirkei, the Psukei de Zimra of Shabbos and Yontov. So we say the Perek of Hodul Hashem Kito, Kila Olam Chasto, Hodul Elokim, Kila Olam Chasto. There are 26 psukim in that Mizmor Tehillim. There are 26 times we say Ki La'olam Chasto. Right? 26 times Ki La'olam Chasto, says the Gemara. Why 26? Because there were 26 generations before Matan Torah, and before Matan Torah, in a sense, mankind was living on credit. In other words, they were living on the assumption that they would receive the Torah. They were living on pure chesed. They didn't deserve, they hadn't yet spiritually earned their keep vis-a-vis the Almighty. They weren't doing mitzvahs yet. And they weren't doing mitzvahs, they hadn't earned their right to existence. Those 26 generations. And it's only then when Torah was given, then by doing the mitzvahs, in some sense, mankind justified the Chazdei Hashem, the existence we get from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the 26 is a recurring feature. Let's go back to our text for a minute. Everybody with us? So he says here, this, the Amar Rosh Hashanah, Esrim b'shishol doros, for 26 generations, Kodmo derech eretz es haTorah. Interesting description. That what happened was, for these 26 generations, basically in terms of the chronology of the Chumash, the first 2,500 years of mankind, the world didn't yet have Torah. And what was it doing? What was mankind doing for those 26 generations? Was building up what the Chazal called derech eretz. Derech eretz. So derech eretz is a positive word referring to human culture, human relationships, human ethics, right? Being a mensch, right? To be a mensch is derech eretz. Honesty, integrity, the morality of the 7 Noahide laws. All this is not yet Torah, it's derech eretz. But what Chazal are telling us is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created a world where for 26 generations there was the Gemara here, what he calls here, the derech eretz kodma la Torah. Can you see here the word kodma? Kodma means that the developing menschlichkeit is the preamble, the prerequisite for Torah. First you have Torah, first you have a human culture of integrity and of morality, and then on that you can superimpose Torah. In other words, there's the Derech Eretz is comma Aleph is the first floor, but Torah is the second floor. You can't build it on the ground. You have to build it on human culture, and that's Derech Eretz. So this Medrash says, that's what the Pasuk says, Hadahu dichsiv lishmor es derech eitz hachayim. This Pasuk, the last Pasuk of chapter 3 that we've been looking at, says, derech eitz hachayim, says Chazal, derech zu derech eretz. Can you see that? That the word derech refers to derech eretz. In other words, Adam and Chava are expelled from Gan Eden, but the Pasuk here is giving us their job spec. What are they expected to do? For the next 26 generations, they're supposed to develop morality. They're supposed to develop a way of menschlichkeit and human relationships and honesty and integrity. And then, v'achar kach, and only after that, eitz hachayim, zu haTorah. Then on that, you can superimpose the Torah. So this is actually a very interesting and fascinating theme, generally in terms of Jewish education, in terms of development. The Torah emphasizes that derech eretz, the ability to live a life of what we might call menschlichkeit, is a preamble to Torah, right? And that someone who doesn't have the menschlichkeit is unlikely to be able to live a proper life of Torah because he's missing the foundations, right? And all this is a remez in this last pasuk of chapter 3, that the message of the Keruvim was, your job is now lishmar as derech eitz hachayim. Your job description, and Samson Raphael Hirsch on this pasuk, if you have time to look it up, is worth reading, right? He says that the Keruvim were giving mankind their, if you like, their manifesto for the next 26 generations. The job is to develop derech eitz hachayim. I remember from my Rebbe, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Zechron Livracha, I had the zechus to be a Talmud of his for 25 years, and he was a very unique, very special person on so many different levels. I won't go into it now. But there's one very interesting thing that I will mention in his name, and that is when dealing with halachic matters, it is often said that there is. Some of you may know that the Shulchan Aruch is written in such a way that there are 4 different volumes to the Shulchan Aruch. Right? There's Aruch Chaim, Yeredeya, Even HaEzer, and Choshen Mishpat. 4 volumes of Shulchan Aruch, and that's the whole compendium of halachic life. Right? And it's often said, though, in conversation, that there is a 5th chelik of Shulchan Aruch. And in Yiddish, they speak about the 5th chelik of Shulchan Aruch, which is what? Which is common sense, which is honesty, which is integrity, which is menschlichkeit, that if you're going to paskin halacha, you can't only use 4 halakim of Shulchan Aruch, you have to use 5 halakim of Shulchan Aruch. And the fifth chelek is the one of menschlichkeit and honesty and integrity. Whenever anybody said that in the presence of Shlomo Zalman, he stopped them in the middle of the sentence. He said, no, you're absolutely wrong. He says, honesty and menschlichkeit is the 1st chelik of Shulchan Aruch. It's not the 5th chelik of Shulchan Aruch. It's the 1st chelik. Before you even look at the shaila, you have to exercise honesty, integrity, and morality, and to look at the situation. And then on that, you can apply halacha. Now, I've never actually asked him where he got that from, but the source of this idea could well be this pasuk, derech eitz hachayim, which Chazal explained to mean, first you need derech eretz, and derech eretz kodma la Torah. That menschlichkeit comes before the Torah itself. This is a very significant theme, and if we're dealing with Sefer Bereshis, in a sense, it's one of the mega themes or meta themes of the whole of Sefer Bereshis, right? If we ask ourselves, why do we need to hear about all the stories of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and all the events of pre-Matan Torah, right? So, for example, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky writes a few times in his Perush, he says the Avos were called the Yeshorim. They were there in order to teach us morality and menschlichkeit, and the whole purpose of the whole of Sefer Bereshis at a certain level. I'm not saying that's the only purpose, but at a certain level, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky writes in a few places, the whole purpose of the whole of Sefer Bereshis, from Bereshis to Vayechi, the whole Sefer can be summed up in this phrase of Derech Eretz Kodmo LaTorah, building up a nation of people based on morality and integrity and sensitivity, and how they made mistakes along the way, and then they corrected their mistakes, and they did tshuva, and they found their way back again. All that is part of Derech Eretz. And only then can you have Sefer Shemos, which is the book of Matan Torah. But the book of Matan Torah is not the comma aleph, it's a comma bet. It's the second floor. After you've had Derech Eretz, then you can have the next floor. And this, I can't overemphasize the importance of this idea. This idea is of extreme significance. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch used this idea very creatively in the 19th century. And he claimed that actually the new way of life in Europe, of emancipation, and the non-Jewish world opening its doors to Jewish participation wasn't all bad, right? In the Hasidic world, the whole emancipation was considered something evil, was considered to be a temptation to assimilation and to rejection of Yiddishkeit. And indeed, for many people, it was. I might even say for a majority of the Jews in Europe, sadly, in the 19th century, most of them took emancipation as an opportunity to flee Jewish life and embrace assimilation and to abandon Judaism completely. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch came along and said, no, there is a lot in the emancipated Jewish life. The non-Jewish world has what to teach us. We can learn from them how to live a more respectful and morally upstanding and a world of Derech Eretz. So that's what he wanted, was a Torah in Derech Eretz to combine the two. He even felt that the study of non-Jewish culture, non-Jewish music and literature and everything had a refining effect on the human being, and that was Torah in Derech Eretz. I'm not sure if after the Holocaust he would have written quite so enthusiastically about the German non-Jewish culture and its refining abilities on the human being. I'm not sure if he would have written it 100 years later. But as he was writing in the mid-1800s, he spoke about Derech Eretz and the way in which one can borrow. So, for example, in Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's shul in Frankfurt, it was built very much with dignity, right? With Ordnung. Ordnung meant everything was very carefully organized. It was completely different to how Jews had been davening in Europe for hundreds of years, which was more a Stiebel type, Hefka. Every shul was a bit, people were coming in and out, sitting where they liked, doing what they wanted to do. In Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's shul, you only came in if you were a member. If you were a member of the shul, you had your seat. When you came into shul, you weren't allowed to sit anywhere other than your seat. If you sat anywhere else than your seat, the Gabba came and told you please to move. In other words, it was a very well organized and highly structured and much more dignified, was considered to be more dignified. And Hirsch took the view that living in a more dignified way was something we can learn from the Goyim. That's all part of Derech Eretz. Not to live a Hefka wild sort of life, but it was all Derech Eretz. Part of it went overboard a little bit. For example, in the bylaws of the shul of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch was written not only that you had to sit in your own seat, but also, for example, when the chazan was singing, you're not allowed to sing with him. You sit quietly and you listen. There's no communal singing in the Shimshon Raphael's in the Israelitische Religion-Gesellschaft in the IRG of Frankfurt am Main. There's no communal singing. The chazan was an operatic performance, and you were just going to listen, right? And you weren't going to say anything. And of course, God help anybody who schmoozed during shul was also thrown out. And also the part of the bylaws was a very strict dress code, both for the men and for the women. If somebody came not exactly appropriately dressed, they were booted out. In other words, the whole thing was done in a very dignified and organized way. We would call it over-organized to a certain extent, over-organized, and it lost out a bit on the spontaneity and the creativity of everything. But why am I mentioning all this? Because for Hirsch, this was part of Torah im derech eretz. Derech eretz, the dignity of the human being, is not to live in a hefker world, but to live in a more organized and structured world. And to behave in a dignified way, not in a wild way. I'm sure all of us have had the experience of going into an organized shul as opposed to going into a shtibel, right? When you go into a shtibel, then anything can happen. Anybody can sit anywhere and do anything and speak anything and dress any way they like. They can come in and out, and that's how Jews actually lived and davened for many centuries all over Europe until the 19th century. Things became a little bit more well organized. Okay, that was not really my topic for today, but it is Torah im derech eretz, which is, and I just, as a concluding line, I bring you this Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, the famous Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, one of the senior members of the Tanaim, says, Im ein Torah, ein derech eretz. Im ein derech eretz, ein Torah. Which is a very interesting way of expressing the idea that derech eretz and Torah are interdependent. What does it mean? In ein Torah, ein derech eretz. It means if you haven't got Torah, then simply having derech eretz is meaningless. If you've got derech eretz, but you've got no spiritual beliefs and no spiritual meanings and no way of connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then all you're left with is derech eretz, which is in and of itself meaningless. In other words, derech eretz is only meaningful in combination with the Torah. But he also says, Im ein derech eretz, ein Torah. If you haven't got derech eretz, right? If you don't understand morality and integrity and yashrus, then you haven't got Torah either. You might have learned the texts of Torah, and sadly, we have found in every generation, sadly, there are people who we thought were B'nai Torah, who turned out to be immoral and corrupt and not to have derech eretz, right? Every story of a disgraced rabbi is a disaster from this point of view, because we thought they were exemplars of what Torah life was, and they indeed know a lot of Torah, but they haven't got derech eretz. Derech eretz is integrity, honesty, and morality. And so I find this particular Mishnah, this is typical of Pirkei Avos, takes a very complex idea and sums it up in one sentence, right? In one sentence, it's got here a dozen words. Im ein Torah, ein derech eretz. Without Torah, derech eretz is meaningless. But it's also true, im ein derech eretz, ein Torah. If without derech eretz, Torah is also meaningless. So they need to be combined together. And the origin of this idea, Chazal saw, funnily enough, in this pasuk, in our pasuk of this morning, that the final pasuk of chapter 3 of Bereshis, where it says that when they left Gan Eden, HaKadosh Baruch Hu put the Keruvim there. And what did the Keruvim tell them? The Keruvim told them, Lishmar as derech eitz hachayim. That from now on, the goal of human life is to develop the derech, which is derech eretz, and combine it with the eitz hachayim, and that was the goal which was already given when they left Gan Eden. And I find this very, 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 very fascinating, interesting thing. We still have 10 minutes left of the Shia, and for that, I'm going to move on to chapter 4. Second. Okay. Right. Okay. Right, can you see a text which says Cain and Hevel? Yes? Cain and Hevel. For some reason in English, translated as Cain and Abel. I'm not sure why, frankly. I'm not sure why. Neither the word Cain or the word Hevel are difficult to pronounce. I'm not sure exactly why one needs to have Cain and Abel. I'm not sure how Hevel became Abel anyway, but I call upon him. I just put in here Cain and Abel because that's how we English speakers recognize it. But the story of Cain and Hevel is the next drama. After the Gan Eden episode of chapter 3, we now have the two brothers, Cain and Hevel, in Bereshit chapter 4. And this is also a very interesting and profound topic, which lays down certain foundations for the rest of the Chumash. Let's start with the first pasuk here, which already contains some interesting aspects. V'ha'adam yoda es chavo ishto. It's already interesting. This is actually an interesting, wider topic I don't want to get into now in the last few minutes of the Shia. What it means is it's describing the cohabitation of Adam and Chava, that Adam and Chava slept together, and Chava conceives her first child. So this is the very, very first pregnancy and conception of mankind described in the Torah. Why the Torah here uses the word Yoda? Because, of course, we all know that Yoda means he knew her, to know, right? Why does the Torah use the word to know when it really is referring to sexual intercourse between a man and a woman? Why does it use the word Yoda? Okay, I'm not going to spend much time on this at the moment. Let's just shelve that for the time being. We'll come back to that. But Adam and Chava, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had already told them among all the other messages that Adam and Chava got, the first one that they got was Peru Uravu, the mitzvah of Peru Uravu, the mitzvah to procreate. They were told from the very beginning, even before Gan Eden. Don't forget, Adam and Chava were not created in Gan Eden. Adam and Chava were created in the world, and then the pasuk says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu took them and put them in Gan Eden, placed them there. And now he's taken them out of Gan Eden. But Adam and Chava were told from the beginning, Peru Uravu, procreation. So the pasuk says, Adam yoda as Chava ishto. Adam and Chava were together maritally. But Tahar, and she conceived. But Teled, and she gave birth. Es Cain. She gave birth to a boy who she called Cain, which actually the Hebrew here is a bit different to usual. It should have said Vatah Vateled, Vatikra Shemo Cain. It should have said that she called. Okay, we won't go into that for the moment, but she gave birth to her firstborn son, and she called him Cain. What sort of name is Cain? Incidentally, it's not a highly recommended name to give to your child or grandchild, at a bris milah. Cain turns out to be the first murderer of mankind. Vatoma, and she said, look what she said. She said, Konisi ish es Hashem. Okay, so this is a very interesting pasuk. Here is the first mother having her first child, and what is her first reaction? Konisi ish es Hashem. What is it? And of course, and then she calls him Cain, comes from the word konisi, the word kinyan, right? In Hebrew, kuf nun hey means to acquire something, to make it yours, to make it your belonging. In fact, belongings in general are often referred to kinyanim. Kinyanim are things that are mine. They're mine. So kinyan refers to the idea of, I would say, possessiveness. Look what I've done. I've created something, and I've acquired something which is mine, right? That was her first statement, and that's what the name she gave to her firstborn son, and that was the beginning of the first disaster here. This particular sentiment of Konisi Ishes Hashem, of giving birth to a child and thinking, instead of feeling this is a matnat Elokim, this is a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that I have the duty to look after and to cultivate and to develop, feeling, gosh, look what I've done. I've done something great. I'm a tremendously powerful and important person. Look what I've done. I've acquired a child, right? We've come to Konisi Ishes Hashem. I've acquired this child, and she gives him the word Kayin. And indeed, Shem Shrefuel here, she's actually very interested in the word Kufnun Hey in lots of different contexts. It's interesting, incidentally, that in a bird's nest, right, the nest that a bird makes is called in Hebrew a ken, Kufnun, a Kufnun. Shiluach HaKen is to sending away the mother bird from the nest, right? And the nest is a symbol, if you like, of a private property, of a private area of possessiveness, right? So, but what is the negative side of possessiveness? What is the negative side of it? So what's the Hebrew word for it? Let me show you the Mishnah. You'll recognize straight away. The Mishnah back to Pirkei Avos again. So Pirkei Avos says, Rabbi Lezer Akapa Omer. Rabbi Lezer says there are 3 human weaknesses, each of which, if a person becomes gripped with this feeling, if this feeling comes to dominate their life, it'll destroy them completely. And the first one is hakinah. So I want you to have a look at the word kinah, for example, closely for a minute. The word kinah, which means jealousy, right? To be jealous of what other people have, to be jealous of what another person is, to be consumed by you having less than somebody else. That kinah comes also, can you see in it, the same word, kuf nun aleph. Kuf nun aleph of kinah, jealousy, is a derivative of kuf nun hey, which is possessiveness and possession, because jealousy is derived from this feeling of possessiveness. And jealousy is a very deeply rooted, one might say, a deeply rooted natural human weakness. In other words, everybody has within within the human soul, there is a tendency occasionally for jealousy. And jealousy is a natural feeling which we have to overcome. But people who are gripped by jealousy, it can bring them to the worst things possible. And I'm going to finish the shir in 1 or 2 minutes, but I'm just telling you the key to understanding chapter 4 of Bereshis is that Cain was born from his mother, who had an excessive sense of possessiveness. She called him Cain, and because he was called Cain and he grew up in that atmosphere, he became a person who was obsessed with jealousy. And out of his jealousy for his brother, he ends up killing his brother Hevel. Committing of the first murder in the Torah is a murder derived from jealousy. And this jealousy is the kinah, which is the kinyan, which is the konisi ishus Hashem. These are all what the Torah here is trying to describe to us is the human weakness, which is jealousy, which can lead a person completely totally in the wrong direction. And this is what happens to Cain. Having said that, it's also Chazal do mention that kinat sofrim marbe chochma, that one can have jealousy, which is positive. And I'll try and remember to come back to that in the next year, that there is such a thing as positive jealousy, but only in spiritual matters. If you see somebody who's achieved something spiritual, which you feel is wonderful, and to be jealous of that, and that jealousy can motivate a person to achieve something more in the spiritual realm, that Chazal call kinat sofrim, the jealousy of Talmidei Chachamim, that can bring a person to higher levels. So jealousy is there, it's hardwired into everybody. But chapter 4 of Bereshis is a health warning, telling us that the first boy who was born became obsessed with jealousy and then ultimately became the first murderer in the Torah because of a overdose of kinah, which he couldn't overcome. But this concept of possessiveness leading to jealousy, leading to other acts of immorality, is really the story of chapter 4, which we will be looking at, please God, in greater detail next week. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. That's it for today. You can unmute yourself if you want to. I hope you've enjoyed this. It's looking at Sefer Bereshis a bit more in depth.
Thank you, Rabbi Kimche.
Great pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Very nice to see you. Nice to see you, Cyril.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Adele, nice to see you, Adele. Nice to see you. Sure that Eddie's doing his job properly. I get that. I understand that.